Carl, do you think the kind of complex brains that we have really could have evolved from single-celled organisms that don't have any brains? Oh, you believe the kind of brains I have could have. Damn, that's cold. Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of Living as Nature. Today, we're going to discuss how life moved from single-celled organisms to the wide variety of unicellular and complex multicellular life forms we see today, including humans and Carl. The broad answer to this question is evolution, the biological phenomenon of variation in species and descent with inherited modification over generations. To simplify this discussion, I'm going to focus on two aspects of this evolutionary process. First, the origin of multicellular life. Second, evolution operating through natural selection, alongside mechanisms such as genetic variation through sexual reproduction, genetic mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. Collectively, these ideas will paint a picture of how life moved from single-celled organisms to the wide variety of organisms we see today, and how humans are connected to and indebted to other life forms in this narrative. Let's start with the rise of multicellular life. There's a few theories about how multicellular life evolved, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, since multicellular life arising from single-celled organisms seems to have happened multiple times in the narrative of life, at least 25 depending on your definition of multicellular. We should start by noting that multicellular life didn't evolve because single-celled life forms failed. In fact, unicellular life has been immensely successful on Earth. Single-celled organisms are still around today, and they can have devastating effects on complex life forms like humans. Just think about the bacteria Yersinia pestis. By the way, also my new nickname for Carl. This is the bacteria that causes Black Plague. It's estimated that this single-celled prokaryote has caused over 200 million deaths throughout recorded human history. And if it doesn't go without saying, single-celled organisms will probably be here long after humans are extinct. This raises a question. If single-celled organisms are successful, why did multicellular organisms evolve in the first place? We can talk about multicellular organisms in a few ways. First, there's multicellularity in the sense that multiple cells, which can survive independently, work together toward a common goal as a colony, with certain cells in the colony even taking on specialized tasks. We might call this colonial multicellularity. These entities aren't quite fully multicellular in the sense that they don't reproduce as one whole genetic organism creating another whole genetic organism. And again, they can survive independently as single-celled organisms. Second, there's what we might call true multicellular life. In this case, the collection of cells constitutes an individual in the sense that they can't live independently of one another. They are tied together and genetically identical. Their reproduction process produces another individual like them. That is, another multicellular organism with the same genetic makeup and similar features. One theory is that the rise of multicellular organisms began with colonial multicellularity, which may have been directed by the value of cooperation in avoiding predators, or in dividing labor, or again in producing goods that are beneficial to the colony and its members. A transitional phase saw groups able to reproduce at a group level, which led eventually to true multicellular life. The transition to true multicellularity may have been facilitated by a process called ratcheting. Here, ratcheting refers to traits that cells developed as part of these colonial clusters. These traits were beneficial to the cluster, but would have been detrimental to the individual cells living as single-celled organisms. So it became more and more beneficial for the cells to stick together. It's important to note that colonial forms of multicellularity are possible for prokaryote cells. But true multicellularity, as I'm defining it here, has only occurred in eukaryote cells. Although we should note that there are also single-celled eukaryotes. Shout out to the amoeba and Carl. It's also important to stop here and note that, while earlier discussions on Darwinian evolution focused heavily on competition among living organisms for limited resources, the rise of multicellular life seems to have been driven at least in part by a radical cooperation among living organisms. Although, of course, this cooperation was compelled by competition and limited resources. Still, it's worth noting that cooperation seems to have played an important role in the evolution of life. Of course, we've already seen this in episode 7, with the occurrence of endosymbiosis, which explains the mitochondria in eukaryote cells and the chloroplast in photosynthesizing plant and algae cells. So, you have single-celled organisms, you have colonial multicellularity, and you have true multicellular organisms. And of course you have blurry phases between these. Nature doesn't really like sharp lines. Outside of this shift from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms, how do we get so many different forms of single-celled organisms, and so many different types of multicellular life? The most reasonable answer comes to us from a collection of sources collaborating, debating, and coalescing together over the past 200 years. A primary example of these sources is the famous biologist Charles Darwin. Darwin didn't invent the idea of evolution. The idea existed well before his time, but he did provide a basic structure to the theory that is echoed in our understanding of evolution today. Darwin's central idea was that the differences in creatures, including differences between species, could be explained by variations that occurred and were passed along through descent. But Darwin knew that the concept of modification with descent wasn't enough. We need something to explain why some traits persist and some don't. For this, Darwin proposed the concept of natural selection. Some modifications made organisms better adapted to survive in their environment, or better adapted to attract sexual mates, while other modifications made organisms less equipped to do so. Those that were better equipped would survive and breed. Those that were not better equipped would not survive and would not breed, and therefore would not pass their traits along. In this sense, natural selection, combined with the concept of modification with descent, could explain how creatures change over time. Interestingly, Darwin didn't come up with this theory on or even immediately after his famous voyage on the Beagle, though that certainly helped. It came to him after reading an essay by the English economist Thomas Malthus entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population, which talked about population growth and limited food supply. Essentially, this got Darwin thinking about how life is a competition for limited resources, and not everyone can survive. Darwin pulled all of his ideas together to suggest that, over a long period of time, think millions of years, smaller variations in populations could give rise to new species, and explain why different species lived in different environments and were well suited to do so. Small changes occur within species, of course. Sometimes this is referred to as microevolution. But over a long period of time, an amalgam of changes could occur that would produce a different species. Though it should be noted that the term species is a bit squishy. It's not a completely uncontested, consistent term in biology. At any rate, with these ideas, Darwin sought to explain how nature could produce endless forms most beautiful. Darwin's root idea was rather simple. In fact, it was so simple that others were upset they didn't think of it first. The famous biologist and contemporary of Darwin, T.H. Huxley, after reading Darwin's On the Origin of Species, famously said, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." But Darwin's simple, albeit powerful, idea had some issues. One issue was that it threatened the religious ideas of a lot of people. Now, to be clear, many Christians, for instance the botanist Asa Gray, firmly supported Darwin's views and found them wholly compatible with Christianity. A majority of Christians believe this today. But others found Darwin's long timeline a threat to what they perceived to be the biblical worldview. A worldview in which the Earth was rather young, perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 years, and that human beings were utterly unique, created especially by God, in God's image. How can humans be made by God and in God's image, they asked, if they descended from apes? In a debate about Darwin's views, the Bishop William Wilberforce asked T.H. Huxley, who was defending Darwin's views, if he claimed kinship with apes through his grandmother or his grandfather. As a side note, it's important to say that evolution does not maintain that humans descended from modern-day apes. It only argues that humans and modern apes share a common ancestor. Finally, Darwin's view challenged the idea that the world demonstrated God's existence because of its intelligent design. If nature itself could explain why species were fit for their unique environments, think white bears in the snow and brown bears in the woods, then you really don't need God to explain it. Leaving these religious issues aside, Darwin's views had other, arguably larger issues. First, Darwin couldn't quite explain how these variations occurred in creatures. We need to understand that, kind of impressively actually, Darwin put forward his theory with limited information. He didn't know about heritability in the way that we know about it today. He didn't know about DNA or genetics. That information just wasn't available, so he had trouble explaining how variations arose in the first place. Second, at the time, Darwin's view lacked the substantial evidence that supports it today. For example, there weren't really transitional fossils when Darwin first published his work. In fact, in the first edition of On the Origin of Species, 1859, Darwin himself stated that the lack of such fossils was the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. But he also noted that the fossil record itself was rather poorly established. It still had a long way to go in terms of discovery. And in the 1860s, just a few years later, the first fossils for Archaeopteryx were discovered, highlighting a transition from dinosaurs to birds. Since then, the record has filled out more, though it should be noted that fossils are only rarely created and even more rarely found. At any rate, for more evidence today supporting Darwin's theory, see the links in the description. To be clear, this isn't to say there wasn't any evidence to support Darwin's theory at the time. There certainly was. For instance, the famous Galapagos finches, similar creatures with different features adapted to their unique environments. Comparative anatomy also supported his view. I make these points not to discredit Darwin, but to highlight that his view had to stand the test of time and further scientific discovery, and it has. But this means that today, when we discuss Darwinism, we're talking about what is referred to as the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism, which combines Darwin's basic notion of descent with modification through natural selection and genetics, stemming largely from the work on inheritability done by the botanist and Catholic priest Gregor Mendel. Mendel's work demonstrated that traits could be recessive or dominant, and were passed on from parents to offspring through a set of principles of inheritance. To understand how Mendel's observations eventually developed into modern genetics and influenced evolutionary theory, it's helpful to understand a few basic concepts that came into focus during the 19th century. By way of disclosure, I'm not discussing these ideas in the order they were discovered. I'm just trying to create a semi-coherent picture of how they fit together. First, chromosomes, alleles, and phenotypes. You'll recall from a previous video, episode 6, that DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, carries the genetic code in living organisms. In eukaryote cells, DNA is stored in the nucleus. For prokaryote cells, it's free-floating in an area of the cytoplasm referred to as the nucleoid. Recall that prokaryotes don't have a nucleus. DNA is made up of nitrogenous bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, that combine with phosphates and sugars to form nucleotides. These nucleotides string together in strands and connect with other strands to form that famous double helix. A strand of DNA that carries a specific instruction, for instance synthesizing a particular protein, is referred to as a gene. An organism's DNA, and all the genes therein, are coiled up together in a set of chromosomes. The sum total of an organism's genetic code is referred to as its genome. And the way the genome is expressed in the organism is referred to as the organism's phenome. An organism's phenome is impacted not only by its basic genes, but also by its alleles. Alleles refer to variations within a gene. For example, humans have a set of genes that code for eye color, but we can have different combinations of nitrogenous bases in those genes to code for different eye colors. So you can have genes that code for eye color, but you can have an allele of that gene that codes for green eyes, or blue eyes, or cold dead eyes if you're Carl. We can refer to the specific alleles in an organism's genome as its genotype. And we can refer to the way that these alleles express in observable traits, for example height and eye color, which can also be impacted by environmental factors, by the way, as the organism's phenotype. Second, genetic variation through sexual reproduction. When organisms reproduce through sex, the result is genetic variation in the offspring by the shuffling of the genes of the parents. To simplify this process, let's just consider humans breeding. No, Carl, we don't need a parental advisory warning. I don't mean like literally. What is wrong with you? Humans have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes in most of our somatic, or body cells. Homologous refers to the fact that each chromosome in the pair is roughly the same size and shape and has the same genes. But, and this is key, the alleles are different. So you might get a blue eye allele from one parent and a brown eye allele from another parent. Now, to reproduce, humans have to produce gamete cells, sperm cells and egg cells, which contain only half of the genetic material they inherited from their parents, so only 23 chromosomes. This happens through a process called meiosis. Without going into too much detail, between the process of meiosis in creating gamete cells and the recombination of genes, there are literally trillions of genetic combinations possible for every two parents. So, children will be similar, but unless they're identical twins, which means they come from a single zygote that divided, it is virtually impossible that any two siblings will be identical. Collectively, these ideas help explain genetic variation through sexual reproduction, but it doesn't really explain how differences arise in the first place. For instance, how did genetically different single-celled organisms come from the first single-celled organism? That brings us to our third point, genetic mutation. This refers to random changes that occur during the copying of genes. When single-celled organisms reproduce, most do so asexually. The DNA replicates through the work of proteins, and the cell divides. Because there's only one parent organism, the offspring is genetically identical, because it's a result of genetic replication. However, when DNA is copied, there's a copying error in about 1 in every 100,000 bases. Now, most of these errors are fixed through the process of proofreading and correction, which is done by DNA polymerase. But some errors still get through. For humans, the average error rate is about 1 in 1 billion. That sounds really low, but remember, we have a lot of DNA in us. For other mammals, depending on the mammal, the rate may be higher or lower. These errors are referred to as mutations, random changes in genetic code. For single-celled organisms that reproduce asexually, these mutations are passed on to their genetic offspring, which means that those offspring aren't, strictly speaking, genetically identical. For multicelled organisms like me and you, mutations can occur when somatic cells reproduce. This is one cause of cancer in organisms like us. But mutations can also occur in gamete cells and be passed along to our offspring. Now, mutations can be neutral, beneficial, or harmful. Sometimes this is decided by the environment. For example, a mutation may give a predator an advantage while hunting in a snowy environment, or a prey animal an advantage in evading a predator in that same environment. In other cases, inherited mutations can be intrinsically harmful. Consider, for instance, a child born with cancer. Mutations can be influenced by environmental factors, but on the whole, they're random. And they can explain how a lot of variation arises within organisms, and how one single-celled organism can give rise to different types of single-celled organisms, even if that organism doesn't reproduce sexually. Fourth, genetic drift. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm tired. I just want to note that genetic variation can be affected by completely random events, and these events may have nothing to do with the organism's overall fitness for survival or attracting a sexual mate. Consider an extremely simplified example. In a group of insects, there are red insects and there are blue insects. In this particular environment, there is no advantage or disadvantage to being red or blue. It's just a difference, a variation in the group. One day the insects are chilling on the ground, and a sudden stampede of mammals comes racing through. Maybe they had just killed Mufasa. That one still hurts, Carl. Still hurts. Now, by complete chance, the stampede just happens to kill most of the red bugs, but it only tramples a few of the blue ones. A few generations down the road, you're going to have mostly blue insects. It's not because one was more fit for survival, it's just that a random event occurred that happened to cause the gene pool to drift in a particular direction. Fifth, gene flow. The genetic makeup of a group can be affected by migration. Again, to simplify the matters, if you have two groups of insects that don't interact with each other, and one is red and one is blue, and suddenly some chums from the red group decide to migrate over to the blue group and start interbreeding with them, eventually in that group you'll have some genetic diversity. This is caused simply by migration and sexual reproduction. Gene flow. When we combine all of these various ideas with the concept of natural selection, whether that means selection for survival or selection for finding a sexual mate, we get a much more complete image of how organisms develop and change over time. Some mutations or variations make organisms better adapted for particular environments, or for finding a sexual mate. Other mutations or variations make them less likely to do so. And if we add to these ideas the possibility, as Darwin suggested, and as evidence in comparative anatomy, the fossil record, embryology, genetics, species distribution, and more supports that changes can accumulate over time to produce new species, we have a viable explanation of how natural mechanisms can produce the wide variety of living organisms we see today. None of this is to say that the book on evolution is closed. There are still plenty of new pieces of information to learn. Better understandings of concepts like plasticity, which refers to the ability of some organisms to rapidly change their phenotype based on their environment, are better shaping modern understandings of evolution. And new theories, for instance the extended evolutionary synthesis, are also keeping discussions alive. That said, there are a few important and well-established points to be made about evolution. First, all creatures share a common genetic blueprint because all creatures are related to one another. Among humans, there's a 99.9% genetic similarity from one person to the next. But humans also have almost a 99% genetic similarity with chimpanzees. Cows? You're looking at about an 80% genetic similarity. And even fruit flies and banana trees have somewhere between 60 and 50% genetic similarity with us. This suggests that all life has common genetic ancestors in the vast tree of life. So, you and every other living organism on the planet are part of the same community of life. Second, human existence is built upon the unbroken line of struggles and cooperations of other living organisms. We are, as it were, standing on the cemetery of the countless organisms of evolutionary history. Without their collective battle alongside and against one another, and against entropy, we wouldn't be here. Third, the narrative of life highlights how the universe seems to be an interplay of law-like regularity and chance. We are here because there's a certain law-like regularity that seems to direct the narrative of life within the context of the narrative of the universe. But we're also here because of random mutations and freak extinction events. Perhaps because an asteroid happened to hit the Earth at one point. This interplay between law-like regularity and chance will be the focus of our next video. Until then, farewell.
Do you think we did okay, Piglet? Was that good?
Yeah, I know. There wasn't as much humor, I know. It wasn't as funny, but
I thought we did all right.
good. I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I was just... Carl!